a saxophone, let out an awful moan, let out an awful groan. It makes
A standard reproducing apparatus, simple in construction and easily manipulated, will at a moderate selling price be placed on the market. Those having one may then buy an assortment of phonatograms to be increased occasionally, comprising recitations, songs, chorus and instrumental solos or orchestral pieces of every variety. Prominent singers, speakers or performers may derive an income from royalties on the sale of their phonatograms, and valuable plates may be printed and registered to protect against unauthorized publication. Collections of phonatograms may become very valuable, and whole evenings will be spent at home going through a long list of interesting performances. Languages can be taught by having a good elocutionist speak classical recitations and sell copies of his voice to students. In this department alone, and that of teaching elocution generally, an immense field is to be filled by the gramophone. Addresses, congratulatory, political or otherwise, can be delivered by proxy so loudly that the audience will be almost as if conscious of the speaker's presence. A singer, unable to appear at a concert, may send her voice and be represented as per program. And conventions will listen to distant sympathizers, be they thousands of miles away.
That was a speech given on 16th of May 1888. You would think it was from this guy, or even this guy. This guy knows who it is. He's listening to him. Those are the words of Emil Berliner. Why is it most people have never heard of him? Emil Berliner helped launch an industry worth billions. An industry that dominated popular culture worldwide. The lateral-cut flat disc gramophone record. Development of this disc record spawned everything from vinyl records, CDs, DVDs to hard disk drives. It all took place in the age of invention and inventors, and it was anything but friendly. Emil Berliner was a German-American inventor, and best known for inventing the lateral-cut flat disc record. He made important contributions to telephone technology, was attracted to aeronautics. He also designed a lightweight internal-combustion motor that became a widely imitated prototype for aircraft. Under his general supervision, his son, Henry Berliner, designed a helicopter that flew successfully as early as 1919. But that's not where the story starts. Credited with the first successful reproduction of sound, Thomas Alva Edison was not the first person to propose that a method of reproducing sound was possible. French inventor Charles Cros had predicted that after sound waves were etched onto a glass disc, a copy of the track could be made in a metal plate and used to recreate the original sounds. The engraving process was not new and had been successfully used in a device called the phone autograph. At about the same time, Thomas Edison was conducting his experiments based on a similar idea. In 1877, he was successful in impressing the sound waves into a tin foil sheet wrapped around a rotating drum, and is credited with inventing the tin foil phonograph. In 1880, Alexander Graham Bell, having just received the Volta Prize from the French government, was looking to invest in a new project and had felt that Edison's tinfoil phonograph had potential. Experiments were conducted leading to many improvements to the phonograph. Unlike the tinfoil method, which resulted in a recording which could not be replayed more than a few times with any success, Bell's research yielded a machine which was capable of a relatively permanent recording on a wax-coated 6-inch long removable cylinder. To manufacture and distribute this machine and subsequent models of it, the American Gramophone Company was founded in 1887. This company, which eventually consolidated with the Columbia Phonograph Company, was to be the source of bitter court battles for the father of the disc record, Emil Berliner. Up to this point, the techniques used to record and reproduce sound incorporated a groove being etched or indented vertically into the surface, which was in contrast to the side-to-side lateral motion of the etched sound wave which had been proposed by Crows. History of the disc record gramophone begins with the Berliner Gramophone Company's founder, who immigrated to the United States in 1870 to avoid the Franco-Prussian War, settling in New York. After a brief career as a traveling salesman, Berliner again went back to New York, where this time he was most fortunate in obtaining a position as general cleanup man in the laboratory of Konstantin Fahlberg, the discoverer of saccharin. This experience in a research laboratory fired Berliner's ambition, and he decided that science, research, and invention were to be his destiny. In his early days, while he taught himself about electricity and acoustics, Berliner began to experiment in a small lab he built in his apartment. His interest led him to work on an improvement to Alexander Graham Bell's newly invented telephone. Berliner's experiments resulted in a practical transmitter, for which he applied for a patent on June 4, 1877. Berliner then sold this patent in 1878 to Bell for $100,000. and was retained as a consultant by the company. After solving the problem of creating a master from which other copies could be pressed, Berliner went to Germany and sold his idea to the Kammer und Reinhardt Toy Company, which marketed his invention for the next 4 years as a toy that played 5-inch vulcanized rubber or celluloid discs. This advantage, which would eventually result in the demise of the cylinder recording, is considered Berliner's greatest contribution. When his interest switched to mechanical recording and reproduction of sound, he patented his first gramophone in 1887. It used a flat phonograph disc across which a stylus moved horizontally. This innovation improved sound quality compared to a vertical stylus movement used in Edison cylinders. The sound volume was higher due to the hard plastic records it used, and the gramophone recordings also captured more of the original sounds. All in all, it was a vast improvement compared to existing devices. Berliner began pursuing entry into the American marketplace with a new hand-driven gramophone that played larger 7-inch discs. After several failed attempts to raise sufficient capital, Emil Berliner founded the Berliner Gramophone Company to control the manufacture and sale of gramophones and records. Unfortunately, Berliner's early forays into the talking machine market met with limited success, as a hand-driven mechanism was more of a novelty when compared with the more sophisticated Edison or Columbia products of the period. What was needed was a spring motor to give his invention a chance to make headway in a market that was showing signs of great potential. Berliner's problem was solved by a New Jersey machine shop owner named Eldridge R. Johnson, who designed a proper working motor that became the basis of the most recognized talking machine in history. With the introduction of the improved gramophone in 1897, Berliner was finally ready to make a significant dent in the talking machine market. Marketing of the new machines was to be handled by the National Gramophone Company set up by Frank Seaman to promote and sell Berliner's products. Under this arrangement, Berliner neither built nor marketed the gramophone, but as the patent holder, he made his profit by buying from Johnson and selling to Seaman. With Seaman's aggressive marketing style and the improved gramophone of 1897, sales were off to an impressive start. The earliest disc records were made of a variety of materials, including hard rubber. A shellac-based material was introduced and became standard. Formulas for the mixture varied by manufacturer over time, but it was typically about 1/3 shellac and 2/3 mineral filler, pulverized slate or limestone with cotton fibers to add strength, and carbon black for color. The production of shellac records continued throughout the 78 RPM era, which lasted into the 1960s in countries including Canada. In the 1890s, the diameter of the earliest discs was generally 5 inches. By the mid-1890s, discs were usually 7 inches in diameter. By 1910, the 10-inch record was by far the most popular standard, containing about 3 minutes of music or other entertainment on one side. From 1903 onwards, 12-inch records were produced, mostly featuring classical music or operatic selections. The earliest rotation speeds varied considerably, but from 1900 to 1925, most records were recorded at 74 to 82 RPM. In 1898, the Columbia Gramophone Group, seeing the likelihood of a competing technology, launched a patent suit against the Berliners and Siemens' respective companies for marketing a product which they felt infringed on their patents. Columbia's strategy was to go after the marketing company, along with the patent holder, in hopes of getting an injunction to disrupt the sales of gramophones just long enough to allow them to enter the disc market with their own product. The suit itself had little validity and would eventually be settled in favor of Berliner. But in the interim, the pending injunction was to cause many problems. Seaman decided to protect himself by forming the Universal Talking Machine Company and began building a new line of machines, the Zonophone. He began to stockpile his new line, and when he had sufficient quantities, he ceased his orders for Berliner's gramophones. This created a major problem for both Berliner and Johnson, who had no experience or facilities to market or distribute their product. Siemens' next move was to accept, in 1900, a consent decree in court admitting infringement of Columbia's patents, and thus the court granted Columbia a permanent injunction, making it illegal for Berliner and Johnson to sell their products. The crafty and ever manipulative Seaman then proceeded to make a deal with Columbia, which allowed him to sell his Zonophones under the protection of Columbia's patents. This turn of events was most serious for Johnson, who had a large stockpile of machines. In order to get back into the business, Johnson established a new company under the name the Consolidated Talking Machine Company and began marketing his machine. An injunction was obtained against Johnson, but he succeeded in having it lifted, and sales then progressed beautifully. Eventually, Berliner and Johnson prevailed in the courts, and a deal was struck with Berliner so that Johnson would take ownership of the patents. In October 1901, the Victor Talking Company was founded by Johnson to hold these valuable patents. The company was named Victor to celebrate the Berliner court victory. Wanting to maintain a stake in the industry and having surrendered his rights in his patents in other countries, Berliner decided to move his operations to Canada, where he had been granted patents in 1897. This move was also necessary as, under Canadian law, he was required to establish production in Canada in order to maintain his patents. Berliner chose to move to Montreal as he was personal friends with many of the officials at Bell Telephone, which was headquartered there. Once there, he opened his first Canadian retail store under the name E. Berliner Montreal, housed in the space he rented from Bell Canada at 2315 Rue Saint-Catherine, and later set up a factory to supply the company nearby. The first Canadian Berliner gramophones pressing began on 7-inch discs, which were pressed from matrices belonging to affiliated Berliner companies in the United States and Europe. Production quickly moved from 2,000 records into an estimated 2 million. Impressive first-year growth by any standard. The small dog named Nipper was the model for an 1898 painting by Francis Barraud titled His Master's Voice. Berliner officially registered the Nipper logo, which would reign for half a century as the world's most famous trademark, and is still the most recognized symbol of the recording industry. After several years of enviable growth, the company was ready for some major changes. In this year, the E. Berliner Montreal operation was incorporated with Emile's eldest son, Herbert Samuel Berliner, as a stockholder, vice president, and general manager. Emile's younger son, Edgar, would also later join the company as secretary-treasurer. A new recording facility at Rue Peel in Montreal was set up. The company quickly made arrangements to become distributors and record pressers for Victor Records and Berliner affiliates outside Canada. With this major coup, the Berliner company grew tremendously, and within 2 years had to build a new 10,000 square foot 3-story factory at the corner of Rue Saint-Antoine and Rue Lenoir to produce both machines and records. The decade that followed saw Berliner capture and maintain the company's position as the leader in Canada, with Columbia a second and Edison's prominence dropping off. Herbert also established a subsidiary of Berliner called His Master's Voice, HMV, which introduced a series devoted to Canadian artists and later expanded to a series of French-Canadian artists. Towards the end of the 1900s, the patents, which had allowed Berliner Victor and Columbia to control the disc record market, began to expire. In the US, this led to an explosion of activity as many new companies began production of records. Feeling that this could lead to an influx of records into Canada, Herbert decided the wisest approach to maintain some control of the market was to establish facilities to manufacture records in Canada for these new companies. Thus, in 1918, H. Berliner's Compo Company Limited, Canada's first independent record pressing facility, opened in Lachine, Quebec. With surplus record presses from Berliner, the company began in 1919 to press, label, package, and ship records for Phonola, followed by the Star Company of Canada's Garnet label. Herbert also began a more aggressive recording campaign, which did not go unnoticed by the family's parent, Victor Company. A rift between the two companies began to grow. As a consequence of this disloyalty, Emile, who had seized control of the company due to its failure to pay him royalties, ousted Herbert and named Edgar as president of Compo. Neither Emile nor Edgar ever spoke to Herbert again. After leaving the Berliner company, Herbert set up the Sun Record Company sales office at 210 Adelaide Street in Toronto to distribute his own labels, which included the Sun and Apex brands. Edgar acquired sole ownership of the Victor Company, and Emil Berliner retired. As the decade drew to a close, Emil Berliner, the father of the disc gramophone, died of a heart attack at the age of 78 on August 3, 1929 in Montreal, Canada. It is a tribute to his genius and drive that 3 of the top record companies began from Berliner's companies. RCA descending from Berliner to Victor, EMI from his British company, and Polygram from his German Deutsche Grammophon. In the same year that Berliner died, the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, merged with Victor in the US and Canada to form RCA Victor. In the mid-30s, a new entrant, Decca Records, had begun eating into the profitable American market. Herbert, again seeing an opportunity, made a deal with Decca to begin in 1935 pressing and distributing their records. In 1955, having moved to California, Edgar Berliner died at the age of 69. This same year, Edgar's son Oliver began producing records for his own label and others, while at the same time opening a music publishing business that continues to this day in California. In 1966, Herbert Berliner, having survived the early pioneering days, the Depression, the introduction of the LP record, the 45 RPM, died in Montreal. The Compo Company was then sold to Decca Records, marking the end of the Berliner family involvement in the Canadian talking machine industry. Years later, MCA purchased Decca, and sadly, in the early 70s, the doors closed on Canada's second earliest record pressing facility, which had been in Lachine, Quebec since 1918. The Musée des Arts Emil Berliner is located in the historic factory of the Berliner Gramophone Company in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. The museum is a technical history museum about the development of music recording, documenting the history of the man, the father of the disc record, Emil Berliner.
Hello, Bobby. I'm going to sing for you. Listen. Write a letter from thy sire, baby mine, baby mine. I could read and never tire, baby mine, baby mine. He is sailing over the sea, he is coming back to me, he is coming back to thee, baby mine, baby mine. He is coming back to thee, baby mine. How was that?